Welcome to episode 2 of the We Can't Believe They Gave Us a Show with Nick and Jim. That guy is Nick.
And that guy is Jim.
That's me. Hi. And we got a special guest today, a police officer. Can you believe that, Nick?
I know.
I know. Michael Sugrue is here. Good afternoon, to you, sir.
How you guys doing?
We're good.
Doing well. How are you?
I am recovering. Nick is very stressed still.
Understandably, yes, but I'm doing very well. Weather's great here in California, and I just want to get it off the table right away because I talked about this at the conference, but it's part of my recovery process. But I always wished I was a firefighter, so I'm just going to put it out there first, and I'm going to say that most cops, even though they don't want to admit it, we made the wrong choice, and we should have been firefighters. So,
And that wraps up this week's show.
That's right. It's okay. We forgive you. See you next week.
No, we did get to just spend, a couple days with you here at the Exotic Beaver Creek Conference. You were our keynote on the second day, excuse me, and standing ovation. And we've got the reviews, and you were the MVP of the whole conference.
Absolutely.
Besides Jimmy Hart, of course, but we'll talk about him later on. But next to Jimmy Hart, you got some rave reviews, my friend.
It was a phenomenal conference. I mean, I got to tell you, I'll be honest, I went in with low expectations, and not because it's a firefighter conference, but just, I kind of went in with low expectations, and I was blown away by this conference. I mean, just the enthusiasm, the participation, and, there was a few cops there, but it was mostly firefighters, therapists, clinicians, but the conversations that I had one-on-one before I spoke and after I spoke were just phenomenal. I mean, absolutely phenomenal. And we kind of touched on it before we started talking and recording here, but I actually had a firefighter that came up to me and said that she actually had a negative experience and perception of law enforcement, and that my presentation actually helped change her view at how she looked at police officers. And it just blew me away. I mean, absolutely blew me away.
That's incredible. I mean, that conversation right there, I imagine you're like, all right, it was worth my trip getting here, because it's not an easy place to get to. And
It's not, but I got to tell you, Ohio, I've never been before to the state, much less the exotic Beaver Creek or Xenia. But just, man, the people there, the friendliness, the environment. I mean, I'm looking at places to permanently retire, and I never thought of Ohio, but after being there, it's on my list now. So I got to say, it was a life-changing event for me.
man,
Well, that's good. That's good to hear.
dude, this room right here, we can put a bunk bed in or something. I mean, make sure we have plenty of room for activities.
Only if I get a big picture of you right by my bed. That's all I ask for.
Done.
Done.
I mean,
Awesome.
that's easy.
Let's do it.
We'll get an oil painting done, right?
Awesome. And make sure Jimmy Hart's in it too. So
It was
absolutely.
I'm keeping it. It was a gift. Oh, good stuff. So, you wrote this book, and this is my James Limpton. The book is Relentless Courage, Winning the Battle Against Frontline Trauma, you and Doc Springer. This book, I know Nick hasn't read it because he can barely read.
That's why we did an audible, just for him.
No. Nick is worried about that baby girl. By the time this show airs, he's gonna be a new dad to a baby girl. So
Absolutely, yeah.
exciting. Awesome. But I read this book and I loved it, and it really helped me with some of the stuff I was going through at that time. And I remember reaching out to you, and you actually helped. You answered, and you gave me such good advice that I really needed at that time. And so when it came time to actually book the show, and Nick probably thought I was crazy, why do you want to bring a police officer to a firefighter show? And it fit. I knew that this is a bigger, what you went through, all that stuff was not just a police officer thing. It's really not even a first responder thing. I mean, it happens all over the place, but just how simply you give and you give and you give, and the way you're treated at the end, like it's like, why did I do all this? Sacrifice and everything, and this is how you treat me. So I know I'm kind of giving a little bit away, but um it was so impactful to read the book, but then also see you speak about it live. And I know, again, standing ovation from a group of firefighters. It was huge. So um I say all that. I guess I need to ask you a question. Let's just kind of start from I guess the start. Um, and I guess the start we probably should pick up on is just, I know you had your Air Force career, but then let's talk about being a police sergeant. And if you don't mind, you don't have to go through everything. I mean, if you want to really know the details, I say buy the book, buy the Audible. But let's talk about the incident that kind of really shifted everything afterwards, if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely. For me, my interest in being in law enforcement started as a child. My stepfather, my hero, he was in law enforcement, and I knew at the age of 8 years old that this is what I was going to do someday. And so, even my military experience, everything I did before I joined civilian law enforcement in 2004 was all geared towards preparing me for that career. And once I got out of the Air Force as a captain in 2004, I went straight into law enforcement in the San Francisco Bay Area in Northern California, and I hit the ground running. Literally, my career was going exactly as I thought it would be. I was getting different assignments that I wanted. I was a field training officer. I was detective. I was undercover for a couple years on a state drug task force. And unexpectedly, I actually got promoted early on. With about 8 years on in my department, I got promoted to patrol sergeant. And my life at that point, it couldn't be more perfect. I was happily married, had a beautiful daughter. Literally, the career was off the charts. My father was healthy. I was healthy. And there was a night that changed all of that for me. And it was December 27th, 2012. And I was involved in a shooting.
Mm.
And I won't go into great detail here because, I do that in the book and I don't want to take up the whole show because I could talk about the whole show just on that. But the long story to make it short was there was a subject with a huge knife that broke into a condominium and was trying to kill a couple that was barricaded inside their bedroom. And I had literally just been promoted. It was my second solo shift as a sergeant. A few hours from going off duty and being off for a few days, we get called to this. I was first on scene, and moments later, I end up confronting this armed subject with a knife. And unfortunately, to save not only our lives, but the lives of the couple upstairs, we were forced to take his life. And, a lot of people think it was just that incident, but for me, that incident was what I call the tipping point. Because up to that point, both in the military and in civilian law enforcement, I had been exposed to hundreds and hundreds of traumatic incidents. No different than firefighters, paramedics, dispatchers. Within a 5 year period, I mean, we're exposed to just, traumatic incident after traumatic incident, sometimes multiple in a single day. And so I never dealt with those things. I never processed them. I always thought none of that stuff's going to bother me. None of that stuff's going to hurt me. And that shooting took away my feeling of invincibility that I'd had my whole career. And literally, it set me down a horrible path of darkness, where eventually, I lost my marriage, my health started to fail. I was fighting for custody of my daughter. We were sued. I'm involved in a federal lawsuit. And it got so dark to the point where I was literally trying to kill myself on duty, hoping that a bad guy would take me out in the line of duty. So that way, my daughter would always be taken care of. She would always remember me as her father. And it was another very tragic incident that took me out of that darkness and got me the strength and courage to ask for help. And that's really the focus of why I'm here and what I do now is to show people that no matter how dark it gets, no matter how horrible things are, where you think there's no way out, because I was there, But I'm here to tell you today, years later, after a lot of work, after different things, involved in recovery, it was a multifaceted recovery process. But I'm living a whole new, wonderful life, a better life than I've ever lived before. And that's why I share my story because, you said in the beginning, but my story is not only for law enforcement, it's not only for military members, it's for all first responders, firefighters, paramedics, dispatchers, but it's also for all of their family members, their loved ones, even their teenage children. This book and what I do, it shows the true human behind the badge and the uniform. It shows that we truly care. We give our all every single day, and we're willing to put our lives on the line every single day for complete strangers. And I know that we know that, but most of the public doesn't realize that. They just see our uniforms, they see our outward appearance, but they don't really see the true caring people that we are deep down inside.
I think one of the things that's poignant about, your story is definitely there's a lot of similarities. I remember we had another speaker at the conference a few years back who similarly had an incident that was kind of his tipping point as well, and he said exactly the same thing of like, I wanted to die in a fire. This way, my family was taken care of. I would be remembered. This, that, and the other. So it really is, any discipline, right? Of first responder. You there's that sometimes that thought process of, especially if you're in a dark place, that things will get better if I'm gone, right? And it's truly not the case. Obviously, that's just going to cause more heartache and sorrow for everybody that's involved.
Absolutely. And, we haven't mentioned it yet, but suicide is the number one killer for all first responders. I mean, in line of duty deaths. And we're much more likely to die by our own hands than the hands of another. And one thing I ask people to kind of take a pause right here and think about is how many times have you heard of like a solo patrol car into a tree or into a sound wall where the officer wasn't wearing a seatbelt? Now, yeah, it could be very just a tragic car accident that happened, but how many of those are actually attempted suicides or suicides where with that same thought process that, hey, you know what, if I die in the line of duty, it's okay. I'm going to be considered a hero. I'm not going to be a coward. And so, I don't think people realize how often that happens. Or, like you said, if you're in a fire situation where you rush into a burning building without breathing protection, or you go into rooms or areas that you should not go into, or you're going up on a roof that's potentially going to collapse, or you fall off a tall building or a skyscraper. I mean, that's what I'm saying here is that we don't think about that. But the reality is some of these horrible accidents are actually suicides that happen. And this is why we need to bring this out into the open and shed light on the reality of what's really going on out there.
You do an amazing job of just talking about this and putting it out there, because the stigma is still out there. It's still there a little bit for the firefighters, but I know it's a lot worse for our LEO brothers and sisters because, just the fact that they carry firearms, you know, they they don't want to speak up because of the fear of getting that taken away or their job security. So it's harder for you guys to really be able to speak out because of that.
It is too. And one thing to think about just the nature of our professions, and this is one area where I'm very envious of firefighters, is that I think firefighters have much more of a true family sense, more sense of a brotherhood, sisterhood, because of the fact that, the way your schedules work and the fact that you're living in the same buildings, you're eating together, you're working out together, you're spending all this time on duty where you're not necessarily at a call or responding to something, but where you have that downtime in between where you can decompress and you can talk about these issues and you actually build these close friendships with people. Whereas law enforcement, we start out together in lineup and then we hit the streets. And most departments, it's solo officers in solo cars. And we may see each other at, certain calls, But once we clear those calls, we're back to our car by ourselves, usually writing a report in a dark parking lot somewhere. But we don't have that same camaraderie and that same closeness. And so, and again, this is my humble opinion, but I think that given that, culture of firefighters, I think that you're much more likely to kind of talk about some of these things or really get to know your people. Whereas in law enforcement, you don't have that closeness and you really don't get to know your people on that level.
Yeah, that
Well,
makes
that's I think that's one of the hard parts, right? I mean, even as you were a supervisor, obviously being a sergeant, and it's not easy to learn somebody's true feelings or behaviors or what's normal in an 8-hour shift, especially when you barely, once an officer goes out of the street, that they're expected to take calls, patrol, do their reports and things like that, where they're not necessarily interacting with their other coworkers. So it's definitely more isolation than obviously the fireside. But I mean, even as a supervisor, because like we talk about, you know getting to know your people and checking in on them, like, hey, how you doing, are you doing okay? The company officer being somebody in the firehouse that can truly know their people, and if they see something that's wrong, or they know each other's families, and they can talk to one another in that fashion, where it's a lot different on the police side.
It absolutely is. And especially being a supervisor, like you said, it is hard to get to know your people. And you don't have that time, you don't have that interaction, and you're so busy, going from call to call. But I think you also brought up a good point earlier about having the firearm involved with that, because there is a fear that, if I ask for help or I reach out, that there's a chance that I'm going to be committed or put on a hold, and that I'm going to lose access to my firearms, which means I can't do my job, I can't do my career. How am I going to pay my bills, how am I going to support my family? But the other reality is, and the stigma is starting to be smashed, as I call it. Things are starting to change slowly. But I have to tell you the honest truth, and I speak all over the country, is that, in many places, there's no progression, there's no resources, and there is a real fear of negative repercussions for assignment, for promotion, and on your career, whether it's in law enforcement or being a firefighter. And I'm sure we'll get into it, but a big part of the thing that I talk about in my book, I call it administrative betrayal or institutional betrayal. And some people call it sanctuary trauma. But basically, it's where we seek out these new families, our blue family for police, our red family for firefighters, and everything's great, everything's going good. And we get to a point where we really need our family, our blue family or red family, and we reach out and they turn their back on us. And this, in my opinion, is what leads most often to suicide. It's not, the horrific things that we see and deal with absolutely take a toll. But I think that final linchpin for most people is when they lose all that support and they have no backing and they feel like there's nowhere they can turn to or nobody they can talk to.
that's what drew me to reaching out to you, because that's what I was dealing with myself. Different circumstances, but still kind of the same result. And that's what ultimately, my ideation started with the betrayal and how I was being treated. And so, and you just kind of being on the other side, just being ahead of me, really was the one that gave me the hope and just kind of just the game plan on just moving forward to what needed to happen. So again, I know I've told you before, but I do appreciate that, because it was huge in my recovery, just having hope, that I was going to get to the other side. But I want to touch on, after the shooting, just in this way, really, in any shooting where everything is going to be reviewed, and you're basically put on leave and you get a little time off. But when you kind of slow down, that's when, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's when kind of everything that you've been bearing, all those hundreds of traumatic calls that you've seen, all that stuff started to show back up. You didn't realize they were there. They were just kind of waiting for the opportunity.
Absolutely. And you bring up a great point because I don't think too many people think about when we have a firefighter or a police officer that's out for physical injury. Let's say somebody has a bad back or a bad knee or a bad shoulder. They're home, they're by themselves, they're isolating, and they're not operational. And this is the key. When we're operational as first responders, we're good to go. We're out there performing, we're getting the job done, we're not thinking about all these things, we're going from call to call to call. We're very successful at that. But when we get removed from our operational status and we're no longer doing that, again, we're isolating, we're by ourselves, that's when a lot of times these things start flooding back. These things that we thought we forgot about, that we pushed aside, that were never dealt with, they were never resolved. Now they're bearing their ugly heads. And this often happens. I've seen in my work as a peer volunteer at the West Coast post-trauma retreat, having been through Save a Warrior, is that oftentimes first responders, firefighters, police officers, they don't realize how messed up they are until after they retire. When they leave the fire service or the police service, that's their identity, that's everything they know, and they're not operational, and that's really when there's a huge suicide risk. That's when all this stuff starts flooding back. And that's why we have to be proactive. We need to deal with these things before we retire, before we leave the service. And that way we can enjoy the rest of our lives with our family and with our loved ones.
I think that's a
Perfect.
big thing is, especially with retirement, is that, you kind of have to be prepared to retire. And there's a lot, I think more often than not, a lot of people are saying, okay, retirement is my goal, right? Like I want to have this career, I want to retire. Um, but not a lot of people have that plan in place of, well, what am I going to do when I retire? Right. And I mean, myself and I'm sure Jim, we're both actively retired now from the fire service, but
I don't know if I was active when I was even working, to be quite honest.
but I mean, there's times like it's funny because like, and maybe you could relate to this, Michael, too, is, like I, I've been sitting on the porch and I hear on a nice summer day or something like that, I hear the sirens from, my local fire department. And I think back of those times of like, summertime riding backwards, going to calls and things like that. But then I got to, kind of kick myself out of it a little bit and say, oh, wait, okay, going up at 3 a.m. to go take care of somebody's running toilet because they can't figure it out. You know what I mean? Like, you kind of have to snap yourself out of it because like there's a lot of, you know, um, romantic parts, I guess, of the job, right? That you remember and good times, but it's those are usually remembered quicker than those crappier times, right?
Agreed. And I still deal with that. I mean, I do miss my time in law enforcement, and there's a lot of things I don't miss, but like you said, there's a lot of things I do miss. And when I see officers out there working the streets, or I see a patrol car go by with its lights and sirens, for an instant, I put myself back there. And even today, I wonder sometimes, like, what if I would have gotten help sooner? I think I'd still be working. I think that I would still have a full career. But in my case, I waited far too long. I suffered in silence for 4 years. And I try to tell people that the sooner you get help, the more likely you are to get better. The longer that you wait, the longer that recovery process is going to take. And so, to be honest with you, I still have dreams, sometimes nightmares where I'm back on the job. And so there's still a big part of me that is there, that will always be there. Because for me, and I think for most people watching or listening to this, it's a calling for us. This is not just a job, it's not just a career. This is something that we've poured our whole life into, our hearts and our souls into. And it is really hard to detach from that. But that's where that work-life balance comes into play, where you have friends outside the fire service or the police service. You have other activities or hobbies that are completely separated, that allow you to enjoy that time off. And that way, some people when they retire, they don't have anything but the job, and that's where they get into that trouble. And so that's why you have to start these practices now, while you're still working, while you're still operational and active.
I think one thing else I want to touch about retirement is when we like it, we all, I think, when we are in the career, we vision how our retirement is going to be. And we know when the date is, and we usually have the calendars that have exactly the days that we have left and all that stuff. And we have this vision of this is how it's going to go. And when it doesn't go that way, then like all bets are off, because it's not as planned, and um, we're just not, I think, conditioned and ready for it. It catches us kind of off guard, and we're kind of left like, oh, I guess I'm retired now. Like, what do I do? I mean, you kind of struggled with that as well, right?
Absolutely. And I made a lot of mistakes, and early on in my career is I was so focused on my job and my career that I neglected things that I should have been doing at home. I neglected communicating with my spouse at the time, and these things led to, a horrible divorce and a contentious fight for my daughter. And I've seen it where a lot of times guys and gals from the fire service, police service retire, and they envision this great life, and yet they have all these issues with their partner, with their spouse, that were never addressed, that were never dealt with. And so this life they envision with their partner, living this great comfortable life, it's now shattered because their relationship is disaster. Maybe their marriage is over. And that's why I don't want people to make the mistakes that I made, because I lost my marriage. I lost my relationship. And you have to be very proactive, and you have to work at this now. Make sure you have that good communication where you're really sharing what's going on, what's affecting you. I didn't talk about the